Hello, one and all, Jake here. You are listening to the audio version of this editorial. If you would rather read the text version, please visit the Substack link in the description. Let me tell you a true story. The other day, I was talking to some people on the internet about how I like retro video games, and someone recommended that I play Celeste, his favorite retro-styled platformer. I responded by saying that although Celeste is a 2D pixel art game, it really isn't very retro-styled from a game design perspective because it lacks stakes and punishment. The exact response he gave me was, and I quote, "I don't consider those to be retro-styled things beyond technical limitations of the time. They were punishing because they were small, so they had to artificially extend gameplay. It pains me to admit it, but I got so pissed off about how wrong this stranger on the internet is that I am now writing a whole editorial about it. However, let me back up a bit first. I bet there are a lot of people listening to this right now thinking, wait, this guy actually has a point. You could beat an NES game in like 45 minutes, and now games are generally supposed to be at least 10 times that long. So, just to be clear, I think there is a very dominant implicit framework under which most game design discourse happens, in which this makes total sense. I do not necessarily hold it against anyone to go down this line of thought. However, I would like to suggest an alternative framework for you to consider. And regardless, frameworks aside, I believe what this person said is just historically incorrect. First, let's look at the claim we're evaluating. Retro games were punishing in order to artificially increase the amount of time players would spend on them. It is true that, on the whole, retro games are more punishing. Many of them had limited lives and continues, and would force the player to start the game all the way from the beginning if they failed too much. However, you could clear them a lot faster. Each game would only consist of 10 or 20 levels lasting probably no more than 10 minutes each, and usually a lot shorter than that. The dominant framework would explain this as follows. Video games back then were built for cartridges that didn't have a lot of space, and so simply stuffing more levels into the game wasn't always possible. If a player could clear these levels super easily, they would get only an hour of enjoyment out of the game, which is atrocious value. However, if these levels are difficult, then players will get stuck on some parts of the game and will have to take some time to figure out strategies to overcome these challenges. Furthermore, with the introduction of punishment mechanisms, the players only have a limited number of tries to clear the levels. So the players would try out new strategies for difficult parts, many of which would fail, then had to spend time just getting back to the part they were stuck on to either practice executing the strategy better or try a different strategy. Naturally, this exponentially increases the amount of playtime required to win, a devious way game developers could stretch out a little into a lot. Nowadays, video games have huge open worlds to explore, tons of collectibles to find, hundreds of missions to clear, and even more content you can download later if the base game isn't enough for you. Instead of punishing the player by forcing them to redo things they've already done repeatedly, which can introduce frustration, modern games make sure that players have a ton of content to sift through, which ensures that they will feel like they've gotten enough playtime out of their purchase. Life counters in general are a rarity, and removing all of the player's progress would largely be considered draconian no matter how poorly they played. Now here's a fun fact. Super Mario Bros. 3 has 90 levels. I don't mean 90 tiny single screen levels, I mean 90 full-fledged side-scrolling levels. And before you ask, no, this is not a case where Nintendo manufactured special cartridges with extra storage space for their first-party games. Licensed NES cartridges had up to a megabyte of storage. Most games varied between 128 kilobytes to 384 kilobytes, and Super Mario Bros. 3 was at the top of this typical range at 384 kilobytes. Obviously, different developers would vary in efficiency at using this space, but realistically, if a developer wanted to make a game with a lot of levels, the cartridge space limitation could be worked around, at least on the NES. Its contemporary, the Sega Master System, is the same story. Cartridges cap out at about 512 kilobytes, and while I'm not as familiar with the Master System library, I would be surprised if there aren't examples of Master System games with a lot of levels. Plus, both of these systems have literal RPGs on them. I won't claim that Final Fantasy didn't run into any technical limitations that prevented Square from doing everything they wanted with the game, but still, it's Final Fantasy. The idea that technical limitations prevented retro games from having a lot of on-paper playtime is preposterous, at least from the third console generation onward. It's clear that the overall structure of these games was a deliberate choice on the part of the developers. But why would developers deliberately choose to skimp out on content for players to enjoy? Even if it wasn't a technical limitation, maybe developers were just lazy and didn't want to make that much content, so they would make the game punishing. And since a lot of players were children who couldn't simply buy another game, they were forced to spend time slowly improving their skills and chipping away at the game, eventually squeezing enough value out of the cartridge to be satisfied. There are a few reasons why I do not buy this explanation, but for starters, let us review some gaming history. So far, I've been talking about home consoles, but those were far from the only retro gaming platforms available at the time. I would split retro gaming platforms into three main categories: consoles, home computers, and the one that blows this case wide open, arcade hardware. It's very important to understand that arcade hardware was king back then. It was the most expensive, with the expectation being that arcade owners would make back their money from tons of people spending quarters at a time to play for a few minutes each. To make sure that people would want to play, arcade developers would use high-spec hardware and relied on flashy, cutting-edge graphics to attract players to the machines. A large chunk of development effort for both home console and home computer games was dedicated to bringing the arcade experience home to whatever extent was possible. Case in point, here's a Sega Genesis commercial that does the talking for me.
You got a Genesis system by Sega. Why? Check it out. Arcade screen left, Genesis screen right. If they look the same, you've answered correctly. Besides, Genesis has real live action in sports games, flying games, and adventure games. A fantastic library, too. So if you want real arcade action, Sega Genesis has it. Or...
Dave, we got your golden axe.
Sega Genesis. We bring the arcade experience home. System and games sold separately.
Huge chunks of libraries for retro platforms consisted of arcade ports, and for the majority of those games, the arcade version is still the definitive version to this day. Now let's do a little thought experiment. If you were designing a game for an arcade cabinet, how might you structure the game and tune the difficulty? There are a lot of old arcade games that go on forever, but the problem with this is that a very skilled player can hog the machine for a long time with only one credit, reducing the amount of money the machine makes. So let's add an ending, maybe a cool final boss that gives players something to strive to overcome. At the same time, you don't want them to reach the end too soon, or else they'll stop spending money because they've seen everything the game has to offer. Perhaps it should be somewhere between 30 minutes and an hour long. And it definitely can't be easy, or else every player could spend one credit, play for a long time, see everything, and never touch the game again. Now if it's too hard and cheap, then players will be discouraged from trying again, so it has to hook them in and be fair. How about if the first 2 levels or so start off simple, and then the difficulty gradually ramps up by incrementally complicating the game? Maybe you get a few lives that only set you back a bit, but if you run out of lives, that's it for that credit. Are you noticing anything? These are the same retro game design elements that this internet stranger chalked up to technical limitations. Retro games are structured the way they are because their design is informed by the arcade setting, regardless of whether they're actually arcade games or not. Even among console and home computer exclusive games, many of them retain design elements common to arcade games that were known to be fun for players. At this point, a big objection you may have is that the gaming landscape back then was very new. Perhaps if the talk on the schoolyard was that arcade games were the best games, that was just accepted as fact, even if it wasn't actually true. Even someone who didn't buy this right away would have been swayed by the fancy graphics, and since the internet hadn't blown up until the tail end of the retro eras I'm talking about, players were powerless to trade information and fight against this marketing push. Now that everybody has been able to share gameplay experiences and discuss game design with more sophistication, we've evolved past these vestigial arcade holdovers into a superior modern age, right? What this interpretation fails to address is the inexorable existence of trade-offs. I learned a lot going to university for engineering, and one principle that I was taught that is constantly cropping up in every aspect of my life is that there is no such thing as a free lunch. Any design change you make to something you're engineering requires you to sacrifice something. Sometimes the sacrifice is barely noticeable for your purposes, so it's a no-brainer to reap the benefits of the design change. One might call that an objective improvement, but this does not mean there was no sacrifice. This applies to game design as well, and to show how, I'm going to identify the dynamics that are lost when a game is made with less stakes and punishment. To illustrate my point, I'm going to use a modern game as the basis of comparison, and what better choice than the very game that inspired this whole editorial, Celeste. To be clear, I am not turning this into a Celeste roast session, Celeste is a fine game, I just thought it was a very fitting example to illustrate my point. Celeste is a 2D pixel art platformer released in 2018, and even though the art style and genre might fool you into thinking it's a retro style game, in terms of structure, it is decidedly modern. Celeste gives you a small number of robust tools to maneuver around obstacles. Of course, you can run left and right, jump, and move left and right in midair. You can also climb walls for a limited amount of time and wall jump off of walls. There's also an 8-direction midair dash that can be used for extra height, extra distance, stalling, and all sorts of other purposes. Throughout the game, your character gets upgrades to be able to perform multiple of these midair dashes in a row before landing, allowing for increasingly complex maneuvers around the levels as the game progresses. There are other mechanics, but those are the basics, and on its face, this is a recipe for success. You get a simple yet flexible toolset that you can permute in complex ways to solve increasingly difficult platforming problems. And admittedly, this is how a lot of retro games are set up mechanically, but the modernity I'm talking about primarily lies in how the gameplay is structured. Something you'll notice watching gameplay of Celeste is that when you die, you don't lose much progress. In fact, that's an understatement. When you die, you respawn quickly, ready to get back into the action from the closest respawn point you've reached. Respawn points are distributed quite generously. There are often multiple per screen. There is no life system whatsoever. You have unlimited attempts at each portion of the level. If I'm not mistaken, the only way to lose progress through a level is to quit from the menu and then start playing a different level. If you do that, then you can only start from the farthest checkpoint you've reached, which is a different progress marker than the respawn points, but still prevents you from having to play through the whole level again. It doesn't matter how many times you die, you will never lose any progress until you choose to end the session. Some of you are probably thinking, this actually sounds awesome. Why would I want to replay something I've already beaten over and over again? Well, put Celeste in the back of your mind right now and envision this scenario. You're at a friend's house and you're taking turns trying to beat a game that you guys both have recently picked up and started to enjoy. It's your friend's turn, and this run is going pretty well. He ends up dominating a boss battle that normally gives you a lot of trouble, and it's because he found a safe spot on the screen that lets him attack the boss while only having to worry about dodging one of its attacks. A few extremely clutch dodges and quick boss kills get him past an infamous stretch of the game unscathed. The run continues going really well to the point where your friend gets a bit nervous about throwing. The nerves cause him to screw up during a part of the game that normally is pretty straightforward, and he needs to blow some resources he's built up over the course of the run to stay alive. However, he ends up getting to what seems to be the final boss, which is farther than either of you have ever gotten before. At this point, the tension is overwhelming, and your friend dies to the very first attack, ending the run. Now it's your turn, and you realize that if you can implement that strategy for the boss battle you had struggled against and just continue to play solidly, you should be able to get to the final boss with more resources intact, potentially beating the game on this try. With the tension resolved, you eagerly start the next run, ready to build it up again. Okay, that's the scenario, and now I have a question. What game were you guys playing? Because the rest of this editorial has been focused on retro gaming, you might have envisioned some kind of hack and slash or platformer from the NES or SNES era, and that's valid. One choice that is not valid, though, is Celeste. To be clear, this is not because of some technicality like Celeste not having a boss battle with a safe spot that you can hit the opponent from. There are several details about Celeste that prevent the exciting dynamics I have described from cropping up. 1. Celeste doesn't have any persistent resources to manage over the course of a play session. In case you weren't sure what I was referring to when I mentioned resources, I mean depletable tools that players can accumulate during a play session and which they may optionally use to help them complete their objectives. Resources can be as literal as weapon ammo and screen clearing bombs, or as abstract as extra lives and continues. The important part is that there is not necessarily an intended time to use them. They could be used strategically throughout a run, fallen back upon if the player ends up in a difficult situation, or saved up and spammed to cheese the final boss. In Celeste, the closest thing to a depletable resource is the player's dashes, but those are refilled just from hitting the ground. Also, it is pretty transparent exactly where the levels intend for players to use their dashes to clear jumps. If you figure out a way to clear a jump using one fewer dash than intended, that does not then give you a bonus dash to use on the next jump. A player who gets to the halfway point of the game without dying once is exactly as well equipped as a player who died a dozen times on the previous screen alone. Consequently, the concept of a good run does not really exist in Celeste. For the most part, I will address speedrunning later. A player cannot end up in a uniquely advantageous situation through clutch plays and smart routing, so there's never anything at stake. This deflates tension and dampens the excitement of progressing through the game. There could be short gameplay sequences that you find difficult and could therefore still experience a microcosm of this dynamic within, but the magnitude does not come anywhere close to what retro games are designed to provide. 2. The level design of Celeste is too one-dimensional to create opportunities for strategic skill expression. Celeste is designed in such a way that players at all times have access to tools that can perfectly solve the problems they are confronted with. In a vacuum, this may sound like great game design, but it actually has a chilling effect on depth. There may be a one-time puzzle of figuring out how to clear a jump, but it shouldn't take long before you figure out that you're supposed to jump there, dash there, fall for a bit, then dash there and there. When you figure this out, you cannot unfigure it out. You are cursed with knowledge of the solution forever. Once you execute this solution by pressing the correct buttons at the correct times, you've cleared the jump and achieved the binary success criteria. In contrast, retro games frequently give players toolkits that are indeed capable of solving the problems they're confronted with, but not in such a perfectly designated way. For instance, let's use Castlevania as an example. In case you need a primer, Castlevania gives you a whip that's kind of clunky but free to use, and an assortment of backup weapons which can only be carried one at a time and are generally more useful than the whip, but require hearts to use. The enemies are agnostic to which method you use to kill them. The layout of the level and enemies might incline you toward using certain weapons, but you have to keep in mind that there's no such thing as a free lunch and you're going to have to make trade-offs. To use a specific backup weapon, you need to contend with the fact that you have to find the weapon drop somewhere, overwrite your current weapon, and spend some hearts. To use the whip, you have to contend with the lack of attack speed and range. Because of all this, you're never going to clear a level in Castlevania and say, "That's the solution, I figured out the way to clear this stage." Even though you've achieved a success in the form of clearing the stage, maybe you could have saved some hearts by using the whip in certain spots, or maybe you could have kept the cross instead of switching to the watch so that you could start the next stage with the cross, or maybe you could have saved some health. Rather than being binary, success is a spectrum and it will accumulate over the course of a full game run. Because the solution space is multidimensional in this way, it is possible to watch other people play and pick up potential strategies from them, like in our hypothetical scenario. This keeps the game interesting for longer, even if there is less total level volume to get through. 3. The progression system of Celeste is antisocial. The concept of sitting down with someone and passing the controller back and forth playing a single-player game is a much more natural fit for the average retro game than it is for Celeste, and the reason why lies within Celeste's progression system. Retro games often have a very natural stopping point for a player's turn, the game over screen. Once you game over, you simply pass the controller to the other player and wait for them to game over. It's elegant and it's analogous to the common etiquette for taking turns on an arcade cabinet. Compare Celeste, which is designed for one player to die many times attempting to traverse hundreds of level segments. There is no system of lives or game overs, but passing the controller every death would be extremely tedious. Perhaps the players could impose a stopping point of 10 deaths before the other player gets a turn. Maybe the exact number needs tweaking, but something to that effect might work. However, there's a problem with this. The game is automatically saving progress, meaning each player will have chunks of the game that they personally never completed. This is a cooperative run, and for players to want to do this, they will need to accept that they could end up robbing themselves of the satisfaction of finally clearing a tricky part of the game and earning their own progress. Alternatively, they could meticulously keep track of every section that the other player completed and go back to those sections on their own later. But it strikes me as absurd to even want to play this way from the outset. For what it's worth, each player is also robbing the other of the one-time puzzle of figuring out how to clear each jump in much the same way. Rather than the value-added dynamics of strategy exchange, tension, and friendly competition that are present when a retro game is enjoyed socially, it is actually value subtractive in several key ways to play Celeste with another person. Now, some listeners may be compelled to retort to this by saying that some of the dynamics I am claiming are not present in Celeste do exist when the game is speedrun. Time losses and gains accumulate over the course of the run, causing the concept of a good run to emerge, therefore reintroducing tension, stakes, and the potential for clutch gameplay moments. Plus, there actually can be a tangible benefit for clearing a segment in an unintended way, namely save time. So Celeste is actually designed to be enjoyed on multiple levels. Casual players will enjoy the generous checkpoints and handcrafted level solutions, while people who want a meatier experience can speedrun the game. You're getting the best of both worlds this way, right? I would not really say so. First of all, retro games can be speedrun as well, so it's fair game to compare the regular experience of beating Celeste to the regular experience of beating a retro game. A subset of players might go above and beyond and start speedrunning games they like, but I would say there is some merit to the game naturally inducing a player into multifaceted decision making, rather than being content with some players self-imposing a tougher way to play the game and giving the rest a shallow experience. Secondly, time tends to be a one-dimensional measuring stick for evaluating the player's performance. There can certainly be trade-offs involving time, but the decision of which trade-off to take is always just going to be whichever one saves time if you're speedrunning the game. This leads to a situation where the game has one correct speedrunning route. Perhaps there are less risky alternative strategies that a player might take if they're doing a live demonstration or a very long speedrun that's running ahead of pace, but the pool of viable strategies is still rather small. It does not recreate all of the dynamics present in a punishing retro game. Lastly, and perhaps most importantly, in addition to speedrunning, many retro games also feature a score counter that allows for score play. Score counters are often regarded as a mere vestige of the arcade days that act as nothing more than clutter for the UI, but this view is incredibly misguided. Score play allows highly skilled players to show their expertise beyond merely beating a game, and it introduces a whole new layer of decision making to gameplay. Scoring systems can actually be quite complex and multifaceted in a way that time alone cannot be, and funnily enough, in a lot of games, the amount of time left on the level clock can actually factor into a player's score, which means speed play is actually a subset of score play in those games. I believe many people have the impression that score play has been solved for most retro games, but in reality, this is only true for some iconic games such as Pac-Man. There are many games with scoring systems where it is not trivial or potentially even possible to prove what the highest possible score one can earn in a stage is. I will leave a link in the description to a video that discusses score play in Sonic the Hedgehog 3 that might give you additional food for thought, and realize that Sonic 3 is only one game. There are thousands of games out there with scoring systems that haven't been explored very much at all. Now, some of these games probably have very exploitable scoring systems that degenerate due to, say, an infinite enemy spawner, just like there's some great games that have atrocious speed play. But this does not contradict the premise that, on the whole, the design of Celeste has not unilaterally progressed past that of retro games. At this point, I think some of you are probably taking a step back and thinking something along the lines of, okay, maybe hardcore super players can appreciate these layers of depth, but most people are not hardcore super players. Most people are trying to experience the game and move on to the next one. And with Celeste structure, you get to experience a whole lot more with a whole lot less friction. Honestly, this is a fair point, but I would like you to take an additional step back and think about the landscape that led you to that thought. For decades now, if you pay attention to language from the video game industry, the gaming press, reviewers, both independent and professional, game developers, and even textbooks used in game design classes, that has been the predominant model for how people play video games.
The only real issue is that this bare-bones launch needs a lot more content to keep the good times going, as it only takes a short while to see everything Wildgate has in store before familiarity sets in and there's not much left to do but grind. I have a lot of hope that given some time to cook up new characters, ships, dungeons, and NPC baddies, this could become a staple among my friends. But for now, it's a very polished starting point.
It's good for players to feel motivated via UI or completion percentages. These are very valid design techniques and tools. But it's also good if players are self-motivated because they're actually seeking out interesting content.
But instead, we got a Mario Kart that feels weirdly empty and lacking in content for a modern game, especially one with so much potential. We've spent nearly a year without anything new. If they do give us some stuff soon, then it's just weird that we had to wait a year for something to actually do. I get that. Geez, we haven't even brought up the $80 thing yet. I mean, it's like every Mario Kart is just a bunch of tracks with nothing to do but race with other people and no other content or progression system or anything. What more do you want?
A massive world, a deep class and progression system, and hundreds of hours of content, including endgame, all with full crossplay and cross-save. No Rest for the Wicked launches on PS5 this October and is available to wishlist now.
They buy a game, beat it, maybe go for 100% completion if they really like it, and then they don't touch it again for a couple of years at least, if ever. Then they buy another game and do the same thing for that one. Just like a movie or television show, the video game is treated like a serving of content for the player to consume. They are allowed to ask for seconds if they really liked it, but the intent is clearly that one serving is satisfying. There are some things you can do to make your game stand out to this archetype of gamer. You can make the graphics unique and or pleasant to look at, you can deliver the gameplay along with a gripping narrative they can get invested in, and of course, you auto-load it up with the C word, content, so that they will play the game for longer to get through it all. See, the gist of how this archetype of gamer calculates how much value they got out of a game is by dividing the amount of time they spent playing the game by the amount of money they spent on it, and then multiplying this quotient by a fun scaler. I'm going to call this the content brain framework for evaluating video games, with apologies owed for throwing more frameworks at you. Under the content brain framework, of course games that are less punishing are going to be seen as better. The average person is pretty averse to adversity, and punishing difficulty is an obstacle to consuming the game. But as I have been clearly posturing toward, I would like to advocate for a different framework for evaluating games. Instead of viewing them as analogous to movies and television shows, consider analogizing them to musical instruments instead. This might sound a bit strange, but think about it. Watching television is a static activity. There really is not such a thing as being more skilled at watching television. Some people might pay closer attention or are better read and can catch allusions to other works and analyze the show more deeply, but the television is not going to give you any feedback about how well you're watching it, and practicing analysis is an entirely separate endeavor from the act of watching the show itself. In fact, I have a hunch that the people who watch the most television actually are not particularly better at analyzing television shows. But playing a guitar is dynamic. You get feedback in the form of the sounds your instrument is making. You can get more skilled and become more capable of playing the songs you want. There are several constituent micro skills that you can practice, and your performance will improve the more time you put into it. Learning how to play a couple of songs is barely scratching the surface of what playing the guitar has to offer. I don't think anything is inherently wrong with either of these types of activities, but I don't think it would be too controversial to say that in the long term, spending time on playing an instrument is likely the more fulfilling way to spend time. Ultimately, video games are capable of taking on many different forms, but they are clearly capable of supporting skill expression to varying degrees, which supports the analogy to a musical instrument. In other words, people can engage with video games as opportunities to master a craft rather than as content to consume. A person engaging with the hobby in this way would probably evaluate games based on their capacity to support said mastery. For example, what kinds of skills does the game reward, and does decision-making continue to be interesting at a high level of gameplay? I am going to call this the mastery brain framework for evaluating video games. If at a high level the strategy degenerates, or your score is too dependent on random chance, or the game design falls victim to any of the many other possible failure modes, then the game loses longevity and becomes less appealing to invest time into. Meanwhile, the content brain framework completely ignores high-level gameplay as a fringe aspect not really worth considering too deeply. Designing a game primarily for the content brain framework is short-sighted, because given enough time with the game, people will inevitably start to approach high levels of gameplay, and so the most devoted fans of the game are ironically the most at risk of having a lousy gameplay experience. Now, I have a question for you. How much content does a guitar have? It doesn't really have any content, but more importantly, that question does not really make any sense to ask. People don't purchase a guitar to consume it, they purchase a guitar to play it. Likewise, the mastery brain gamer is not concerned with how much content a video game has. You do need some rules, levels, and obstacles for the video game to actually function as a game, but as long as the gameplay is robust and skill is rewarded with feedback, a gamer who is pursuing mastery can get a lot out of very little. In fact, there's potential for practically infinite gameplay arising out of a dearth of content, because just as there is no cap for how good you can be at playing guitar, a game that is designed with the Mastery Brain framework in mind is less likely to have a human achievable skill cap. Punishing difficulty is another thing that the Mastery Brain gamer does not really care about. You ran out of continues on the final boss and now you have to start from the beginning? Whoops, you played the wrong note on the last measure? Oh well. You're having fun, so just take it from the top and try again. Furthermore, consider that if this is a game that you really are sinking your teeth into and trying to become a virtuoso at, your time spent at the skill level where running out of continues is a concern is going to be an increasingly small fraction of your total time with the game. Industry trends have made people lose sight of the fact that a lot of interesting gameplay can emerge from a very small and simple set of rules. Instead, there's a drive to reduce the friction and adversity that players experience while judging through the game's finite pool of content. This is an inherently unsustainable way to make games, and it is designed around an inherently unsustainable way to enjoy games. Eventually, content will always run out. Mastery will last for as long as players have a drive to improve. So between a content brain modern game that gives all skill levels gradual progress, and a mastery brain retro game that rewards skill but punishes unskilled play by resetting progress, which is truly the waste of time to play? I suppose the answer depends on the value each individual person places on the extrinsic versus intrinsic rewards from playing games, but it seems like those who value the latter have been relegated to an afterthought by the industry. With this idea in mind, take a look at this quote from earlier in the editorial. Even if it wasn't a technical limitation, maybe developers were just lazy and didn't want to make that much content, so they would make the game punishing, and since a lot of players were children who couldn't simply buy another game, they were forced to spend time slowly improving their skills and chipping away at the game, eventually squeezing enough value out of the cartridge to be satisfied. I brought this concept up as a steel man to argue against from a historical perspective, but I would like to point out just how backwards this is from the mastery brain perspective. Slowly improving skills and chipping away at a game is not something these players are forced into because the developers did not put enough content into the game. It is the very experience that these players are pursuing by playing games in the first place. If you thought of this explanation as plausible when I first mentioned it, I hope you are starting to grasp the Mastery Brain framework enough to evaluate the explanation from that lens instead and marvel at the contrast. I am not here to blindly hate on modern gaming. If you are making the decision to play video games, then please play whichever ones you find interesting and worthwhile. But hopefully your mind has become a bit more open to the perspective that game design has not evolved past harsh punishment, and that there is something worth exploring in retro games if you can overcome the adversity inherent to them. I implore you to take some time pondering deeply about what the dynamics are that you enjoy from the video games you play, exactly how much or little needs to be in place mechanically for those dynamics to emerge, and what sort of fulfillment you aim to get out of playing video games. If you believe that game design is an art form, then I will leave you off with an analogy. Nobody looks at the Mona Lisa and says things like, well, it was fine for its time, but with modern paints and painting tools, you can make something objectively more pleasing to the eye. We have evolved past this. That would rightfully be seen as absurd. So why should we let similar ideas fester regarding classic video games?